orientation of the maps and the shape of the maps, the way that the land of Israel is drawn, has evolved over time. And I'm also going to show you, even if you think you know a lot about mapping Israel and the Holy Land, I'm going to show you some quite rare 20th century maps that you may not have seen. So there's quite a lot here. So at various times, the land that is now Israel has had numerous names. It's been Eretz Canaan, it's been Terra Sancti, it's been the Holy Land, it's been Palestine. And I'm going to use all of them through this talk, trying to observe the choices of the map makers at the time, not any particular political conventions or anything. And when we're talking about Palestine, as far as I'm concerned, it's because other people called it Palestine. It's got nothing to do with any opinions about a state called Palestine or the politics of the region. So this quote from Ezekiel is circa 600 before the Common Era, and it's considered to be the first biblical reference to map making. And you mortal, take a brick for yourself, place it in front of you, and carve a city, Jerusalem, on it. And this is believed to be a reference to some kind of effort to map the city of Jerusalem. And that's the earliest reference that we've got that can be interpreted as being a biblical reference to mapping. The earliest maps that we know of in the world are these maps which are called TO maps. And they're called TO maps because they're circular, and that's the O. And you can see there's a T shape inside the O. And they represent what was seen as 3 continents. Asia is shown at the top half, with Jerusalem being given very high precedence within Asia. You can see Jerusalem there. Europe is in the left lower quadrant, and Africa is on the right. And that also gives you an indication for what was known of the world in the period around 500. This early example of a TO map is from a journal or a book called the Jugurtha. So the primary source that we have for mapping Israel is the book of Joshua. And this is a fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is believed to be an original or a near original copy of the book of Joshua. The authorship is disputed by rabbis. Ascribe the authorship of the book and of the last 8 verses of Devarim to Joshua. Modern scholars have argued that it's a compilation of different authors, but we don't need to go through that. What we do know is that in the biblical account, Joshua outlines in words the borders of the tribal areas within Israel. And this is really important because what you're going to see is dozens and dozens of attempts to take the text of Joshua and mark it out on a map. And it became a fascination for scholars to actually try and represent the 12 tribes of Israel on a map of the Holy Land, derived from the text in Joshua. So what we're going to be looking at as we look at these maps is we're going to be looking at a biblical tradition and a classical or scientific tradition of map making. Sacred texts inspired the map makers to illustrate the topography of their faith. Whether you were Jewish or whether you were Christian, this was an important text for you, and understanding the Holy Land and how it related to the biblical stories was important for both faiths and was the source of many of the early maps. what we know is that there were eyewitness accounts of pilgrims, and one of the earliest pilgrims that we know of is Jerome, who became Saint Jerome, and they provided a flow of increasingly detailed information about the Holy Land. And that information was transposed into maps, and those maps were copied, and then they were added to in subsequent manuscripts, and gradually they became more and more detailed, all the time building on the work of earlier map makers. The classical school of mapping began as a legacy of the Greek and Roman scientists and historians, and the foremost of those is Ptolemy or Ptolemaeus, whose writings included the foundational text of geography, a text called Geographia, which includes one of the earliest maps of the world that was ever produced. So let's just pause for a second and think about north, south, northeast, south, and west. We are now used to looking at maps, and maps are always oriented with north at the top of the map. And this is so common that if you ever see a map that is not north oriented, you struggle to work out where you are, what it's representing. And we probably all had the experience, if we're using Google Maps, for example, sometimes something happens and it's not facing with north at the top or the way you're looking at the top, and you get very confused. The Holy Land is the only area that has been mapped using all four possible orientations. Ptolemy's maps have north at the top, which is what we're used to today. Istakhri, who's an Arab map maker from, I think, the 9th century, uses a map which is oriented to the south, i.e. it's completely upside down. And one of the purposes of that was to elevate Mecca to the top of the map, because they didn't want to see anything above Mecca. Jerome and most early Christian map makers oriented their maps to the east, and Münster, Blau, and other German and sort of 16th, 17th century map makers published maps with west at the top, which they believed was the perspective that Moses would have had at the end of the Exodus when he viewed the land from Mount Pisgah. The orientation of the maps might also reflect the different views of people arriving in the Holy Land for the first time. If you arrived from the sea, you were looking at the land of Israel with east being at the top. If you arrived by land, you would get a different perspective on it. I mean, that's just a supposition. We don't know why people oriented maps in these different ways. We just know that they did. And you see these little compass symbols at the bottom. As we go through the maps, you'll see I've put those compass symbols at the bottom of the map so you can just have a reminder of which way they're facing. So let's start with the grandfather of geography. Map. This is about 150 in the Common Era. And you can see this is actually a later rendering of his map. But what you're going to see is probably for about 12 or 1300 years following the work that Ptolemy does, his calculations, his location of places on the map, his use of a grid, which you can just faintly see on this map, influences every other map maker, and they draw this as their basic canvas that they then embellish upon. And here, what we've got, whoops, that shouldn't have happened. Go on. Here, what we've got is a section of Ptolemy's map, and what you've got is you have got the coast of Israel being shown there, of the Holy Land being shown. You can see Cyprus up in the sea in the top left-hand side. And this is a north-oriented map. This is an important thing to recognize, that Ptolemy started with a north-oriented map. It's other people who followed him who started twisting and bending the shape of the maps. So the next map that we're going to have a look at in a second is from a guy called St. Jerome. But before we get to St. Jerome, we've got Eusebius, who visited the Holy Land in the early part of the 3rd century. And Eusebius went through the Holy Land, and what he was trying to do was to record the places in the Holy Land that were in the Bible. So another thread for the early biblical map makers was to go through all of the places that are named and find them on the land, and then record where they were relative to other places. And so he produces something, it was called the onomasticon, but in our terms, it's a gazetteer. It's a list of places with references to where they were. And this became one of the core source materials for later map makers. Along comes St. Jerome, who was a pilgrim who arrived towards the end of the 4th century, and he produces this rough map, which you can see here. This is actually a 12th century copy of the original map that St. Jerome produced, because there are no surviving examples of the original one, but we believe it to be a reasonably accurate copy of this map that St. Jerome produced at the end of the 4th century. East is at the top of the map, which is what I was explaining to you. So the Black Sea is to the left, and Greece and the Aegean are in the center of this map, and Jerusalem is right off to the right of the map. You won't really see it, but in the full copy of this, it is there. And it's an important map because it is probably the earliest Christian map that we've got. This is perhaps one of the most remarkable maps of the Holy Land that is still in existence. This is the Madaba Mosaic. It's part of a floor mosaic in an early Byzantine church at Madaba in Jordan. It's a map of the whole of the Middle East. Part of it contains the oldest surviving original cartographic depiction of the Holy Land, and especially of Jerusalem. I don't know whether you can see it just below that large yellowish bit that's missing. I don't know whether you'll see my cursor. I can't see my cursor, so I don't know whether you can see it. But just below that yellow bit, you can see a city, and that is Jerusalem. Among the other features, it depicts the Dead Sea with 2 fishing boats, which you can see. That's probably in the center of the picture. And there's a lot more detail in this. And if I do that, what you can see is this is a tracing that was done that shows you much more clearly what is in the mosaic. And you can see the Dead Sea, you can see the Jordan, you can see Jericho, Jerusalem, and Gaza. And more importantly, you can see that it's, again, east at the top. And we're going to come back to this map later on, because there's been work done much more recently in the 20th century to correlate the Madaba map with much more recent and up-to-date maps of Jerusalem, and actually to show how astonishingly accurate this map is, despite the massive scale of it. So we'll come back to that. So that brings me to the Dead Sea, and the Dead Sea is an iconic shape. Anytime you look at a map of Israel, one of the first things you see is the River Jordan running from north to south, and near the bottom of the River Jordan, you see this great big thing, the Dead Sea. it's had lots of names. It's been the Salt Sea, the Sea of Arabah, it's been the East Sea, the Sea of Sodom, the Sea of Lot. And you can see all of these names and more names used on early maps. But it is an iconic geographic shape that you'll see again and again. And it's also interesting to note that the Dead Sea was not accurately mapped in terms of its shape and size until the mid-19th century. So for hundreds and hundreds of years, people were drawing this, but nobody had worked out a way to draw it accurately. So this map was appended to the section on Joshua in a very early Christian text called Pauca Problemata de Enigmis ex Canonicis. Some problems among the difficulties of the canonical texts. It was written in Ireland in the 8th century. We're not sure who the origin of the map maker was. It's probably not Irish, it's probably from somewhere else. And it's been copied into this book. In fact, there's reason to believe that it might be an Arab map rather than a Christian map. The map is oriented to the north. The River Jordan flows down, you can see flows down the right-hand side from that source at the top. And it runs through down into the Dead Sea. And an interesting point here is that the Dead Sea curves round into an east-west orientation, and we now know that it doesn't do that. And then you can see at the bottom of the map, there's a brown line, which is like a river or a canal that runs into the Mediterranean. Well, we know that that doesn't exist at all. So there's quite a lot of fantasy in this map. But what it does do very neatly is sets out in a simple graphical way the divisions of the tribes. There's no endeavor to accurately map the borders. It's more of a diagram than a map. But it is one of the earliest maps that we have that's come out of a book. This is a spectacular Islamic map by Istakhri. It's come from about 950, so it's well over 1,000 years old. As you can see, it's south at the top because they wanted to make certain that Mecca was at the top of the map, and Mecca sits above Jerusalem and everything else. If I do this, you should get a nice translation of it, and you can see that this is the translation of the area that we're looking at, which is the Palestine area. And you can see Jerusalem there, and then further north, further south, but at the top of the map would have been where Mecca is. And this map appeared in an atlas entitled A Book of Roads and Countries, which was both scientific and a sort of travel journal. So it was a combination. And we believe that it's based on Ptolemy's sources, although the production is very different to anything that you're going to see from the European map makers. So now we get to the early Hebrew maps. And I think the first thing to say is that the concept of cartography was unknown to these scholars. They called their works yitzur, drawing, or tzura, form, and the great names such as the Ramban or Mizrahi Eli called their works Surat Eretz Yisrael, the form or shape of the land of Israel. Over time, these drawings morphed into things that we could recognize as cartographic representations, but the early ones were completely diagrammatic. And it's important to recognize also that none of the great biblical scholars who drew these maps had actually visited the Holy Land. they didn't even know people who'd visited the Holy Land. You know, they lived in medieval Europe. Consequently, this is all derived from the text, and it is diagrammatic. It has no pretension to be geographic. Perhaps the most, this is an important quote. This is a quote from, I think it's from Barber, and he says that Hebrew maps are an integral part of Jewish culture and help us to understand the yearning for return after the destruction of the temple. And I think, you know, the fact that we were trying to map the Holy Land, even though we hadn't been there, these scholars hadn't been there, it was evidence of the centrality of Israel to scholarship and Jewish life in the medieval period. You know, this yearning for a return to Israel isn't something that only happened in the 19th century. This has been characterizing our history for over 1,000 years now. So first up, Rashi, he needs no introduction as one of the foremost biblical scholars that we studied in Cheder, we see in the Chumash, and he was a map maker as well, and he produced these diagrams, which you can see here. The left map is oriented with east at the top, and the Great Sea or Mediterranean runs from north to south down the left-hand side. In the eastern parts, the River Jordan, the Kinneret and the Dead Sea, and the cities of Shwama and Habela. That's aggravating. Sorry, it's come the wrong way around. The right-hand map is, I said the left, and that's the east. The right-hand map is east at the top, and you can see there the sea at the bottom and the various things that I just referred to. The left-hand map has north at the top, and these are on adjacent pages. I mean, clearly, orientation, north and south, geographic accuracy were of no importance to Rashi. These diagrams were drawn by him to illustrate the points that he's making in the text, and Rabbi David could now read the text out to us probably and correct me on this, but they're not there to be geographic. They're simple diagrams, and I think certainly in the back of the old Sonsino Chumash, you've got some of these diagrams at the back of the Chumash, if I remember correctly, or maybe it's at the back of the art scroll. Anyway, moving on. They had no GPS in the medieval period. They had no way of accurately mapping in the way that we're used to now. You know, relatively accurate shapes are few and far between. And the errors that they made were compounded by successive copying. So somebody drew a map, somebody copied that map and added some new features to it. And each time the shape got distorted. You know, geographic accuracy was not a feature of these early maps at all. And it's very important to recognize that and keep that in mind when you're looking at these maps. So now we have a map, which is one of the earliest English maps of the Holy Land. And it's by Matthew Paris. And it's a map of Acre, or Akko, and it comes from around 1250. And this comes from a collection created by Paris in the mid-13th century, and it's dominated by the plan of the city of Acre. Jerusalem, another walled enclosure, is in the top right of the map. You can just see it. And this dates from the time, it's just at the end of the Crusades. You know, we're talking about the time just before the Crusaders are kicked out of the whole of the Holy Land by the Muslim armies. This map by Visconti, dating from around 1321, is massively important. it's massively important because it's got a grid. If you look at this map, you can clearly see the grid on this map, the squares. We think that, you know, we're used to seeing maps with grids on them now. This is one of the first instances that we know of a grid on a map. And it means that you can now start to measure and the different distances between, you can see the Kinneret and you can see the Dead Sea on this map. And the distances from those can now be measured out and everything can be relatively accurate compared to what was being done before. And this is considered to be the first modern map of the Holy Land. It's not. Okay, so as I said before, and I'll try for the third time, this is the earliest printed map of the Holy Land that we know of. It's by a Dutch artist called Erhard Voyesch. He was active in the 1480s. We don't know his exact dates, and it appears in a book called the Peregrinatio in Terram Sanctum. It's an account of a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And you can see it is quite stunning that this was produced in late 1400s. And it was a massive fold out. You can see there the massive fold out that it was, you know, I zoomed in on one part of it. It's just unbelievable. And to have been able to produce this over 500 years ago is quite incredible. This one is the map by Ptolemaeus, reinterpreted by a guy called Berlinghieri in also 1480. And if you just go back to that map that I just showed you and see the different detail in that map and this map, this is a very crude map. It's also got this thing in the bottom right-hand corner, the bottom left-hand corner, sorry, that looks like a jigsaw piece. And that is complete fantasy. There's nothing there that is like that. And the bay just to the right of that is also complete fantasy. This is a shoreline that has been made up by somebody who didn't know what was really there, was copying bits and wasn't sure what was right and what wasn't, and so they've created this. Next map is the same Ptolemy map, by somebody called Holle. It's also from around 1480, beautifully coloured. And again, you can see east at the north. And there you can see a beautiful division of the tribal areas.
Oh no.
It's quite exquisite. And Rabbi Elia Mizrahi's map, 1523, and
wow.
we're still getting a Rashi type diagram. You know, Elijah Mizrahi was a Talmudist, a posek, and an authority on halacha, and he wrote a super commentary on Rashi's commentary on the Torah. And yet, look at this, you know, Eretz Yisrael, and it's a diagram with the arrangement of the tribes and very little else on it. And this is 1523. Meanwhile, in 1538, Wissenberg publishes this map of the Holy Land.
Wow.
And I mean, look at the detail, you know, I mean, these are being published at the same time. And this is a German map maker. This is a wall map. So that's Wissenberg's map, which is incredible. And then 1572, you get Benito Arias Montano. This map is a biblical map. It's still, as you can see, you've got the Mediterranean at the bottom. What you have got is some lovely ships at the bottom, and also you can just see two sea monsters at the bottom, which is which was traditional in that time. They filled in these little sea monsters and ships and things. It's a beautiful map. And then we get to John Speed. And John Speed is the foremost British mapmaker or English mapmaker of the Renaissance. He's been described as England's Mercator. And this is his map of Canaan, and you can see it's still based on Ptolemy. It's got the tribes delineated on it. It's beautifully colored. The coloring will have been done after the printing of these maps. They will have been printed and then hand colored. It shows part of Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula as well. And you've got a lovely whale, something swimming near the Egyptian Sea, and a big ship. And you start to get these beautiful cartouches and little diagrams and everything.
What's Middle Earth?
Pardon, Judith?
What's Middle Earth?
That's the Mediterranean.
And why do you call that?
Med-Terra.
Oh.
Always was.
Oh.
Up at the top, on either side of Canaan, you've got Moses and Aaron. And you start to see these beautiful decorations coming into the maps now. This one is a second map by Speed. It gets in here because it sits in the house of Feldman. And this is this shows the journey of the children of Israel through the desert for the 40 years. And you can see there the way from Goshen to Palestine, and you can see a number of the sites, the places that are named in Exodus are shown on this map. And what is really beautiful is if you look at the bottom of the map, you can see the Red Sea, and you can actually see the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea from Egypt into the desert. I mean, it's the most beautiful thing. Going on a little bit, and you get these sort of gradually more detailed maps being drawn, and you can see the accuracy starting to appear on these maps as we go. And you know, this map by Jansonius shows again, you've got Moses and Aaron at the top, quite interesting. And also the illustration in the bottom right-hand corner is two of the spies carrying an oversized bunch of grapes. So you can see the biblical references that they're sort of decorating their maps with. This is another map by Jansonius, quite simple map with the tribes neatly delineated. You're still looking at a map with the east at the top, beautifully colored, and you're seeing now more color coming into these maps also as we go along. So let's just pause for a second and think about where these maps were being made in this period. Maps making on a large scale has always followed sea power and wealth. And you needed maps to be able to navigate the sea, and you needed the maps for your trade routes and how you were finding your colonies and all of these things. So the Italians were the first ones to make maps, and we've seen a number of Italian maps already. And as the Dutch traders became predominant at the end of the 16th century through to the middle of the 17th century, you see the evolution of the Dutch map makers, and probably the most famous of those is Mercator. And then there's a consolidation of power under the French, and what you're going to see now coming up in a minute are a number of French maps from that period when the French were the dominant naval force. And then from the end of the 18th century to the mid-19th century, England was the premier maritime and commercial power and made the greatest contribution to map making. So here you've got a Dutch Haggadah from the end of the 17th century. It's engraved by somebody called Moses Wiesel, and it was published in Amsterdam. East is still at the top, and you can see the tribes of Israel. Note that this is what I would call a Jewish map, obviously. All the text is in Hebrew. The Mediterranean Sea becomes the Yom HaGadol. This was known as the Amsterdam Haggadah. It was printed, there were 4 editions printed between 1695 and 1810. And it also shows, in addition to the tribes, it shows the route of the children of Israel through the land of Egypt. And this is obviously very, very suitable for a Haggadah, you know, and I'm sure it entertained the children during the Seder for a long time. And you can see here a sort of a translation of that. So this one, we don't know who the author is. It shows Israel as a tree of grapes. It's all in Hebrew. We know very little about it, but it is just a beautiful example of a Hebrew map. It's also north-oriented, so we're starting to get something that's more conventional. And there is something nice about seeing the tree of life being interpreted as on a map. This one is by somebody called Delafosse from 1780. It was published in Paris. It's got few distinguishing features except for the fact that it is exquisitely beautiful. You know, it's not like anything particularly unusual about it. It's north-oriented, and I think now, from now on, virtually all the maps will be north-oriented. And you can see that the shape of the Dead Sea is becoming more accurate. It's a lovely map. This is a map by, let me just check my notes, somebody called Jean-Baptiste Bourguignon d'Anville. So he's a French geographer from the 18th century. We believe this map's from late 18th century. It's very accurate. He's got the tribes of Israel in a little inset in the top left, and a map of Jerusalem as an inset sort of center left, and a magnificent cartouche on the right-hand side. And then here's another Hebrew map, and for the first time we're looking at a Hebrew map with north at the top. This is the Luach Eretz Israel. It's a map of the Holy Land, and it comes from something called the First Hebrew Atlas. And it claims to be a map of the Holy Land as it is in the Bible, copied from the Latin language by Jacob Auspitz of Offen. And you can see the tribes and pretty map. And I'm not certain who's in the cartouche. Oh yes, it's Joshua holding a flag with the 12 tribes of Israel. And Elazar HaKohen. So it's interesting that they've gone from the traditional representation of Moses and Aaron. You've now got Joshua waving a flag with the 12 tribes of Israel. And now we get to what I would call relatively modern map making, and particularly scientific map making. Jacquetin.
Can I ask a question first about that before you
go? Sure.
So that was a map from the previous slide. From what year was that?
1817.
1817, but they're only making historical maps. They're not making contemporary maps of
Correct.
Israel.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. So so Jacquetin is the first scientific map maker that we have in this set of maps. His mapping of Palestine was based on a survey conducted in connection with Napoleon's campaigns in Egypt and Palestine at that time. And he accompanied Napoleon on the campaign and produced 47 maps of Egypt, Sinai, and Palestine. The level of detail on these maps surpasses anything previously produced. And these were, for the next 50 years, the definitive maps of the region. And given the sort of the political events and the changes of control and power in this region in the 19th century, these maps are incredibly important. That is his map of Akko. And you can see the level of detail here. You know, this is substantial detail. And you'll have to take my word for the fact that it's accurate. And then this is the Vilna Gaon. Famous. It's a drawing of the division of the land of Israel. It's 1800 to 1820 as far as we know. It's a copy of a work by somebody called Rabbi Elijah ben Shlomo Zalman, who's 1720 to 1897. But we're talking about early 19th century, and we've still got a diagram being produced. You know, I mean, this is like the last time I think that we're going to see a diagram, but clearly they hold a special place for the biblical scholars. And I'm guessing that it's all driven by those early maps from Rashi, and all of the subsequent scholars take their lead from Rashi in this. And then in the second half of the 19th century, Britain or England's Ordnance Survey started producing maps of Palestine for the British military. The previous maps, which were produced by Jackson, were considered inadequate to meet the requirements of the growing interest in the country. And in 1864, Captain Charles Wilson was sent by the British War Office to undertake a survey of Jerusalem. The survey of Jerusalem was published in 1865. Subsequently, the Palestinian Exploration Fund sent Wilson and Anderson to survey the whole country. They started in South Lebanon and driving in stages through the whole country down to Sinai. The survey took 3.5 years, and in 1871, Kitchener and Conda commenced a full mapping project based on that survey, which produced 26 map sheets, which were published as a map of Western Palestine by the Ordnance Survey. In 1881, Reshimath Eretz Yisrael, a register of the land of Israel according to the maps of the Vilna Gaon, was published in Warsaw. So we're now nearly at the end of the 19th century, and we're looking at a map, apart from the fact that it's in Hebrew, not in Latin or an English script. This map could have been made 500 years previously almost. You know, it's got a little bit more detail than those earlier maps, but it's pretty much the same. It's another east at the top map, and it shows how the Jewish map makers hung on to this old tradition for a very long time. But only a few years later, you're also getting this one, which is Eretz Chemda by Nachum Sokolov, published in Warsaw in 1885. And you know, this looks like a conventional map, a lot of detail. We'd have to zoom in for you to see all of it. But this apparently was produced to go alongside a descriptive, a journey log, you know, by a British government minister called Lawrence Oliphant, and Sokolov produced this map, which was published alongside his journal. And yes, it's north orientated. So now we jump to 1916, and probably the most important map of the lot, the Sykes-Picot map. And this is a copy of the original Sykes-Picot map. I think the original is in the British Library, if I remember correctly. I'm 90% certain of that. This is the map where Britain and France carved up the Middle East. They drew lines on the map. They ignored where people lived. They ignored all the old tribal relationships that existed in the Middle East, and they carved up the Middle East between England and France as they were approaching the end of the First World War. And what we can see here is the blue zone, which is France. And they had control over a coastal strip of Syria. The British had, what did we have? We had a tiny strip. You can just see that arrow pointing leftwards. We had a tiny little enclosure around Haifa and Akko to give us a seaport, but none of the rest of Palestine. And then we had Jordan, and going further east, we had what was some of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. And then this yellowish bit was the international zone. So in 1916, what we call Israel was going to be an international zone looked after by, well, it would have been the League of Nations at that time. And you can see here, I've just zoomed in on this bit, and you can see how most of this is the international zone. That little red bit at the top is the Jewish line. And you can see the red line, which represents the line of the British extent. And of course, that remained the way that Israel was divided and controlled up until the 1930s. This is my mother-in-law's atlas. It's in here because it dates from 1933 when she was a schoolgirl, and it's a time when the world was pink because the British Empire was massive, and in our atlases, as those of us of an age will remember, the British Empire was coloured pink. And the important point to recognise is that by now we have the Palestinian Mandate, and so Palestine, Judea, and what was called Transjordan at the time are all pink, and they're all under the rule of the British government. This is a map from we're not sure, 1939 or 1943. It was published in Baghdad. It's important because when we zoom in, there is no recognition in this map. You'll have to trust. A friend of mine translated the Arabic for me, and I can't remember exactly what it says, but the key point is this is not called the Palestinian Mandate or anything. The Arabs did not recognize the mandate even in that period coming up to the beginning of the war. This is another fundamental map for us. I don't know who's drawing on the screen. Somebody is. So this is the partition map, the 1947 partition. Following the announcement of Britain's intention to terminate its mandate in 1947, the UN General Assembly appointed a special committee to make recommendations on the land's future government. The recommendation was for two separate states, a Jewish state and an Arab state, to be joined by an economic union with the Jerusalem and Bethlehem region as an enclave under international admin. On the 29th of November, the UN General Assembly voted on the petition plan, and it was adopted by 33 votes to 13 with 10 abstentions. The Jewish side accepted the plan, the Arabs rejected it and launched a war. We know the history, we don't need it. The Jewish state is demarcated in green. The pink areas were intended to be the Arab state. And if you look at that, you can see that basically the Jewish state would have been carved into two by that tiny land bridge between the northern part and the southern part. We'd have had a lot of desert and not much else. That's a better blown up version of it. You know, I mean, it would have been, yeah, the fact that we voted to accept that, you know, when it was strategically such a vulnerable, made the southern part so vulnerable, and in fact, the whole of the state of Israel would have been vulnerable in that configuration, is remarkable. The fact that the other side didn't accept it is even more remarkable, in my opinion, but let's not go there. So this is a little bit of history, and no one, apart from Steve Miller, who I have to thank for this, has probably seen these maps before. This booklet was published by the Jewish National Fund out of their head office in Jerusalem in 1949. It lists 373 villages as of March 1949. And it says, and I'm going to read just a bit of this, as the state of emergency following hostilities is still in force, it has been necessary to withhold certain data relating to the settlements. These omissions include the exact location of new villages, although indications are given of the general area, and the final names of a number of new villages are still to be determined, and in these cases, provisional names have been listed. This is actually the state of Israel evolving in front of our eyes. There are, I can't remember how many, I think there are about 12 or 16 maps of different areas. I chose this one because it includes Kibbutz Beit Alpha, where my sister-in-law and my niece and nephews live, which is next to near Fuller and Bet Shean. So, I mean, but all the maps are in this style. You can see the names of all the places, you know, and, well, you can see the names, but of course, some of them have subsequently changed because they evolved over time. But it's just a snapshot in time of Israel in 1949. The Green Line, or pre-1967 border, or the 1949 armistice border, is the demarcation line set out in the 1949 armistice agreement between the armies of Israel and those of its neighbours. It served as the de facto borders of the state of Israel from 1949 until the Six-Day War in 1967. The name comes from the green ink used to draw the line on the map whilst the armistice talks were going on. I have to say that every time I look at this line, I am struggling to see green on it, but maybe it's the color on my computer or something. Yeah, I suppose it is greenish, yeah. It looks greeny blue, I suppose. This is the map, and you can see up in the top left the signatures of the two signatories to this map, and I can't quite remember who signed them, but you can see that this is the original and it is signed. There's a sort of clearer, more recent version of the Green Line map. And of course, it has become fashionable amongst some groups of people to use this green line and refer to the green line and to suggest that we should be going back to the green line. I'm not going to comment. So we get to 1956 and we get to something called the Atlas of Israel. This is massive. It's a great big heavy tome, and it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important because it's 8 years after the foundation of the State of Israel, and they have produced a tome. And this is not an atlas like a world atlas, which many of us had when we were children. This is just an atlas of Israel. And I'm going to show you a few snapshots out of it. But perhaps if you look down at the bottom of the Atlas of Israel, you can see there if you remember the Madaba map that I showed you right at the beginning, there is the Madaba map of Jerusalem embossed onto the cover of the first Atlas of Israel from 1956. This is a map which is showing prevailing wind direction, right? And each of these shows prevailing wind direction in a different month. And you know, they're very complicated maps. There's a lot going on these maps, and I'm not going to try and explain it to you. But what I think is remarkable is that in 1956, the scientists were collecting the data and the map makers were drawing these maps. And this was done, you know, today, anyone who's a map maker would say this is routine technology. In 1956, this was all done by hand, and it was quite a remarkable achievement. This is a symbol which shows the directions of the wind and how many months it's like that, and the strength of the wind. This is a map which shows Jewish settlements by the date of their foundation. And there are maps on, you know, how many people are living in these things. They're just enormous amounts of maps. It goes to hundreds and hundreds of maps of the State of Israel in 1956, and it's updated. It's been updated numerous times. This one is from the 1985 edition. There was a 1970 edition as well. And this is the latest in the series. It's the new Atlas of Israel. It was published in 1980. I'm not sure. No, it's published in about 2008. Right, yeah, it's published in about 2008. It's published by the Survey of Israel, which is the national mapping agency. And it continues in the style of the earlier atlases. It's a magnificent document, and it just is evidence of the fascination that people in Israel have with their own land and the detail within which they're concerned with the land. And here, this is my almost final slide for you. Here you can see the Madaba map on the bottom right. It traced out as an outline on the bottom in the center, and then overlaid on an up-to-date map of Israel, so that they can show how phenomenally accurate the features in the Madaba map are compared with a modern survey of the map of Israel. And there it is much larger, and you can see how accurately they've been able to trace the features from that map across to the modern map. And so a couple of last thoughts. Well, the first space, and this is a satellite map from the European Space Agency. And I think the point is, even from space, you know, even if you were out on the space station, when the space station orbits over the land of Israel, the thing that you see is the Dead Sea. It's visible from thousands of miles above. You know, the Dead Sea stands up as the thing that you'll see. And that is Tel Aviv at night from outer space. those of us who know and love Tel Aviv will recognize the coast. It just shows how far we've come in nearly 2,000 first maps that I showed you to the current maps. So that's my lot. Those are my sources. A visit to the British Library is a wonderful experience. You can go and see many of these maps there. If you're in Jerusalem, you could go to the Israel National Library, which is on the university campus. And within the Israel National Library is the Laor collection. Laor collected maps for about 50 years when he was working in Europe, and then donated them all to the National Library. And you have to phone up and make an appointment to go and visit it, but it's completely free and they're delighted to show you around. And you will see many of the maps that I've shown you are either in the British Library or in the Israel National Library. All of these slides are available if you go to bit.ly/map-Israel. The capital letters are really important if you're doing this. So I recommend them to you. And I think that's it. Yep.